During the time that my dad, George Yancho, was in World War II, his brother, my uncle, John Yancho, was also in World War II as an Air Force pilot. And one of the stories that my dad liked to tell was when he was eating lunch one day in the mess hall, they heard a P-57 fly overhead, and it landed at the field where they were barracked at. And so Dad didn't think much of that, but a little while later, into the mess hall came his brother John. And it was the first time that they'd seen each other in several years. They were both involved in the war and many battles and had exchanged letters, but they hadn't seen each other. So it was a very joyous and tearful reunion. And then my Uncle John was based in England. So before he took off, they loaded his plane up with war souvenirs to the point where the plane almost couldn't lift off to get airborne again on its return flight to England. But it finally, at the end of the runway, was able to lift off, and he waved his wings goodbye and flew back to England. But my dad often told that story because he had missed his brother John so much.
Today we're going to talk with the family of George Yancho. George Yancho was a World War II veteran. He served in the 172nd Combat Engineer Battalion in Europe during World War II. George Yancho liked to talk about his stories of being in the service. And we're going to talk with his widow. Mary Yancho is with us, as well as his son, Michael Yancho Sr. Mary Yancho, when did you meet your husband?
I met him the 30th of July in 1950.
Okay, you knew that exactly. Now, I love my wife. I can't tell you what day we met. How do you remember that it was the 30th of July?
You might think this is funny, but all my friends were married, and I was not. So being a Catholic, I said a 54-day novena that I would find someone that would love me as much as I loved them. And on the last day of Thanksgiving in this novena, I disobeyed my dad and went to Knickerbocker's in the North End, and my dad had forbidden me to go there. And I went with the girls from the office, and who asked me to dance but George? And so the rest of the evening, I danced with George. And he worked nights, like I said, and so every night during his lunch hour, he would call me. And then on Saturday afternoon, he would come to my house and pick me up, and I'd drive him to the Buick to work. And then at 11 o'clock, I would drive back to the Buick and pick him up, and then we'd go dancing.
He was truly an answer to your prayer.
Yes, yes.
I'm going to start with you. Talk about your dad, because was it, being a veteran, part of his life? Was it a big part of his story?
Oh yeah, Dad loved to tell stories about the war, and the older he got, the more stories he told. Things that he may have repressed or came out as he got older.
He was willing, as he got older, he was able and willing to talk a little bit more about those stories that might have been held back when he was younger.
That's true.
That's kind of fascinating. I've interviewed a lot of soldiers, and often they can't tell the stories. They think they can, and they start, and they just can't. But your dad talked to people at schools. He went to talk to kids. He wanted people to understand about the war.
In his later years, starting in about the year 2000, I would say.
We were married quite several months before he started talking about that. And it was just a little bit once in a while, you know. And we were married quite a while before I really knew what he had gone through.
So you knew he went to World War II, but really for your first few years together, it wasn't really something you dealt with at all.
He just didn't talk about himself, you know.
Yeah.
He wasn't important, but other people were.
What did he tell you about the war? He was a combat engineer, so he built stuff. So I'm sure he talked about that. Did he talk about that and about battles? What did he talk?
When he talked, he didn't talk about battles and he didn't talk about death. He talked about, like you said, he was a combat engineer, so he talked about cutting down trees and running sawmills and to build roads and bridges and running rock crushers so that they could have gravel to reinforce the roads. And he talked about building pontoon bridges over the Rhine River for Patton's tanks to cross. Things like that.
So they can talk about getting there, coming back, the marches, and all that kind of stuff. But sometimes that's difficult. Mary Yancho, you were married to the man for 66 years.
Yes.
What did he tell you? Did he talk to you ever about the war in the way that he talked to Michael?
Sometimes. And one time when we were talking about, he was down in a foxhole, and the enemy shot the pistol grips right off of his machine gun.
Ooh.
That's how close he came. But I think the Lord was with him because he just prayed all the time, and he wore his little medal. And so I really think he was protected by the Lord.
When he was a combat engineer. He built bridges. He was there for the Battle of the Bulge, and he was actually served in 4 major battles in Europe in World War II. And when he came back, he kind of liked that business, didn't he?
Yes.
Yeah. Tell us about what he did when your dad got home.
He was a farmer. He was a tool and die maker for General Motors for 40 years. He bought a farm. He'd worked on a farm when he was a teenager up in the Pinconning area. And so he always wanted to have a farm. So when I was 12 in 1963, he bought a farm here in Grand Blanc, and he taught all of us boys how to be farmers. And we grew corn and soybeans and some beef cattle, and we rented quite a bit of land here in the Grand Blanc area, and we farmed quite a few acres for that era. And then later, as my brothers and I grew older, we stopped farming so much land, and he started planting Christmas trees. And so he's been a proud Christmas tree farmer from the late 70s until today.
He was George Yancho was a member of VFW Post 822, and he was on their honor guard.
Yes.
And he thought it important to go and provide an honor guard as soldiers were laid to rest at the cemeteries. Why? Why did you think that your dad thought it was so important?
I think it was because of the friends and comrades that he lost during the war. He told a story about when they were in a particular battle, and one of his fellow soldiers was shot and wounded, and the mortars were coming in, and even the wounded soldier told the medic, don't come. But the medic crossed the battlefield to the wounded soldier and suffered a direct hit from a mortar. And so that was one of the things that Dad remembered. He never told gruesome details about it, but I think that his memories of his fellow soldiers that fell during battle, and so in their memory, I think that's why he wanted to participate in the honor guard.
Did he talk to you about why he took the time to do that?
The war was real important for him to talk about and be grateful that it ended like it did. He just thought it was very important that these people were honored and mentioned.
I think the most difficult one that I'm not sure he ever told the story the way it actually turned out, but his platoon was ordered to blow up an enemy bunker. And so he was a corporal, he left his men behind, and he crept up to the bunker and threw hand grenades in through the gun ports. And so after all the blasting finished and the smoke cleared, he had to go inside and make sure that there was no more danger inside the bunker to the Allies. And he said that when he went inside, he found quite a few dead German soldiers, but he always said that they'd been dead for a while. He said, I never killed anyone during the war. And I think that if you read behind the lines, we might get a different meaning, and his consciousness and his subconscious told different stories and had different memories.
It's important to tell the stories of the veterans and hear them and see what they have gone through and what we have because they went through all this in Europe.
Are you glad to see veterans telling these stories, do you think?
Yes, yes, and he was too. He enjoyed hearing what everybody else had gone through and the results of what they went through.
It's important for veterans and families to tell the stories of their service for our country. I think to pass that information along to future generations so we understand that war is not clean, it's not sanitary, it's dirty, and we really need to think twice about war. And also we need to make sure that the families of the veterans understand what made their fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers into who they are today.
It is good to have this legacy so our children and grandchildren and maybe even outside our families don't take everything for granted that we have, that these men fought long and hard for what we have today, and they sacrificed a lot. Even though they came back, they still had aches and pains and memories of what they had gone through.
Did he have an affinity for other veterans? Did he go off in the corner with a veteran and they talk about stuff that you really didn't know what they were talking about?
Probably when he went to the VFW.
They also had an annual reunion for his combat engineer battalion. They would go typically to North Carolina on an annual basis, while until they all aged to the point where travel was difficult or there were very few of them left. But they'd all get together and talk about their times from boot camp and training all the way through the war.
Do you think it's important for veterans' families to maybe talk about the stories too? They probably know more than they think they do.
I think that these conversations bring out some of those stories. I think it's very important.
Do you think it's a good idea for families to tell the stories about their veterans too?
Oh yes, I think that it's important to know what your family did to help this country, and that they were so proud to do so. I'm sure it was kind of scary. Like George was 18 when he went.
Just a kid.
Yeah, and he never realized at that point what he was going to go through. And I know it was tough when he went through it, but when he come home, he was grateful that he had a part in saving our country.
I just want to ask you, Mary, what do you want people to know and remember about George?
That he was a very good Christian, a Catholic man who really was devout. He said his rosary every day. We prayed before all of our meals, and church was a good part of him. We never missed a Sunday or a holy day of going to church. And I might have said this before, every night before we went to bed, we sat on the couch or laid in bed and said the rosary.
He suffered severe cold in the foxholes during the Battle of the Bulge. He was severely frostbitten on his hands and feet, and he suffered a lot. He's disabled, or partially 80% disabled because of his cold injuries to his hands and feet. So he never complained about that.
Never.
But especially you could see in his hands and feet the discoloration from the frostbite.
At a military funeral, one of the most poignant and memorable things is the passing of the American flag to the next of kin. Mary, they gave that flag to you.
Yes.
And I know it's a difficult thing to talk about, it's fresh in mind, but what were you thinking when that soldier, that ramrod straight soldier came to you and whispered in your ear, basically thanking you for your husband's service?
I guess I felt naturally sad, but I also felt proud that George did serve his country and came back, and proud of him for all the things that he had done. He was really a good person, done lots of things for other people.
Michael, You were there, and they're handing your mom this flag that represents the nation in his service. What were you thinking?
It made me proud that my dad was part of such a great country, and a great service-oriented organization. Those ramrod straight soldiers with spit-shined shoes, taking such great care with Dad's flag and folding it just so perfectly, and then presenting it to my mom. And that flag has a special place of importance in this house as well. So it's
He earned every bit of it.
yes, he did.
Every bit of it.
I want to say that he was also he was buried in a casket that my other two brothers, his sons, built his casket along with their sons. They built his casket in 2 days, and it's a beautiful casket. And I spoke later to the gravesite attendants at Great Lakes Cemetery, and they commented how beautiful that casket was, a one-of-a-kind and unique thing that would have made my dad proud.
Michael, what do you want people to know and remember about your dad, George Yancho?
He was the most well-liked man that I've ever met. He had, for a 92-year-old, when you typically go to a 92-year-old's funeral, a few people come, a few close family members. We've got over 250 thank you cards that we need to send out for people that signed his registry book. But another source of pride that didn't have to do for my dad with battles was he was part of a crew that helped build a cemetery in Holland, the Margraten Cemetery. And they had to build the roads to get to this farmer's field that became a cemetery. And he talked about it was raining the entire time that they built the cemetery road, and they tried to cut down trees and lay them down to form a road, and then they had to form a second layer of trees over the first to support this road, and then cover it with gravel. And so today that cemetery that holds the bodies of lots of Allied soldiers, mostly Americans, the Dutch people really take a lot of pride in that cemetery and take great care of that cemetery. And the Dutch people actually came over about 10 years ago and did a documentary film about the construction of that cemetery and interviewed all the remaining soldiers. And my dad was really proud of that part of his service as well.
That cemetery is one of the largest World War II veteran cemeteries in all of Europe. Has thousands and thousands of soldiers, allies, mostly Americans, that were left behind. A couple of weeks before George Yancho passed away, he had an opportunity. The local Congressman Dan Kildee, asked him to talk about the war, and he did. And he was quite a storyteller.
They asked if Dad would be willing to talk, and at the meeting they asked if he would talk, and they gave him 10 minutes, and he got to the podium and sat in his walker. He was unable to stand for that length of time, but he talked for 12 minutes, and off the cuff, totally off the cuff, ad lib stories. At the end of his story, he received a standing ovation and shook hands with General Stone that was there, received a medal from General Stone, shook hands with Congressman Kildee, and it was a great source of pride, but it also demonstrates how lucid he was and how alert and how well his mind worked till late in life. It was a great source of pride for myself as well to be there with him.
It was in 1945, April, and that was Easter Sunday. We went to work. We went to Mass at 4:30 in the morning, and then went to work putting a bridge across the Rhine River, which ended up being the longest floating bridge in military history. Went across the Rhine River. The Navy helped us. The water was high in the spring, and they made They took this big anchor that we made out of concrete and they put it upstream to hold that bridge in place. And the bridge was done within 2 days. And George Patton, with his tanks, went bumper to bumper across that bridge. And in May, which was only a month, the war ended. So we feel as though we had a part of that. My brother flew P-47s, and in July of that year, 3 P-47s came from England to see me, because he never seen me in uniform. Even though I've been through all these battles except the invasion, these 3 P-47s landed there. I was charged of quarters, and I didn't know they were coming. And that was really something for my brother to see me. I guess my time is about up. So anyway, I'm back and I'm safe.
One of the things that I remember him saying most often was that the German people weren't bad people, that the German people were good, and he enjoyed being with the German people. He said it was just their leaders that were bad.
That's interesting. He'd come back from war, saw horrible things, and yet he remembered that it wasn't the people, it was the leadership that did that.
Correct.